should have known better than to use a homemade Ouija board. We broke so many of the rules, I'm shocked we all didn't die. It started fun enough. My friends and I were just having a good time. Hanging out, drinking some beers, and some suggested we try to have a seance. Just for shits and giggles. We truly never expected for anything to happen. Especially this. We all sat in a circle around some lit candles, held each other's hands and closed our eyes. "How do we start?" Liz asked. "I think we just start chanting," James said. "You fucking dink, you don't just start chanting. First we need to know what we're going to try and contact. Haven't you ever seen a movie where they have a seance? You figure who, then all meditate together, then start asking questions. If someone is there, they answer or give a sign." Liz asked, "Okay, so who? Does anyone have a dead relative they want to chat with?" "My uncle died about 4 years ago. Let's try him." "Alright, let's do it," I said. We all sat there in a semi-darkness, the flickering candle light dancing on our faces. James spoke first after a brief silence. "Uncle Matt, are you there? We'd like to speak to my Uncle Matt. He died about 4 years ago of leukemia. If anyone is here, or he's here, can you please show us a sign?" And we waited. Nothing happened. "Hello, is anyone there? We'd like to talk to you." Still more of nothing. "Man, fuck this. Nothing is going to happen. This is bullshit," I said. "We're never going to do anything this way. We need a Ouija board. I don't have one, but we can make one. Can we do that?" "Yeah, just use some cardboard for the board itself, and we can use more cardboard and a shot glass for the planchette, I guess." "That would work, right?" Liz said. So we made one. It looked like total garbage when we were done, but we really didn't expect it to work anyway, so we rolled with it. We had to Google the instructions because none of us had ever used one. So the three of us sat in a sort of circle with the board in the middle of us. We all put our fingers on the planchette and waited. We didn't know who would talk. Finally, I said I'd go first. "Okay, spirits of the afterworlds." James and Liz both erupted in laughter. "Hey man, if either of you have a better idea, go for it." No, you go ahead. I'm too chicken anyway. I don't want anything attaching itself to me." "Alright, spirits of the afterlife. We would like to communicate with anyone that may be near us right now. Is there anyone here right now?" I could hear us collectively hold our breath, waiting for something to happen or for the planchette to move. Alas, none of us were surprised when nothing did happen. So we tried again. "Okay, we are here to try and contact someone from the afterlife, anyone at all. We just want to speak to someone. Please, if you're there, make an attempt to reach out to us through this board." We all very nearly shit our pants simultaneously when my phone rang a second or two after I asked. Hello, I said. "I'm coming," the voice said through static and fuzz. Oh shit, I threw the phone down onto the floor and stood up immediately. "What? Who was that?" "I don't know, but all it said was, 'I'm coming,' and it was all staticky." We just stood there looking around, dumbfounded. It had to have been a coincidence. How could the call have been from a spirit after all? I wasn't sure what to think right now. "Okay, I'm done," said Liz. "That has me way freaked out." "Yeah, I agree. Let's just call it a night and throw this thing away. Just make sure you save my shot glass though," I said. James set up his bed on the couch and Liz in the spare room. I went to my room for the night. That call had me spooked and I had some trouble falling to sleep. The second I did doze off, James yelped. I leapt to my feet and ran out to him to see what was going on. Liz wasn't far behind me. "Holy fucking fuck, Something just breathed in my ear, like literally right in my ear. I'm not even joking, dude. I'm scared. Really fucking scared. I was laying here almost asleep and someone or something breathed in my ear. It didn't say or anything, it just made a breathy sound. I felt it on my skin. Okay then, we'll all sleep out here so we can keep an eye on each other. Does that sound okay? So we moved the coffee table out of the way and laid our blankets and pillows and just camped out in the family room for the night. Being together in the same room, James and Liz fell asleep within 20 or 30 minutes while I just laid there. My eyes darted back and forth between spots on the walls. I had been in this room thousands and thousands of times, and yet tonight the shadows all seemed different. Thinking of the phone call sent chills down my spine. The voice didn't sound human, but there is no other explanation for it. Liz stirred next to me, then sat up in her spot. She didn't say anything, but only sat there. I called her name, and she didn't move, only silently breathed in and out. When she stood up, I called at her again, and again there was no response. She made her way past me and stared towards a mirror on the wall and then stood motionless in front of it for several minutes. Without warning, she swung her head forward and smashed it straight into the glass, shattering it. Still, she said nothing, but bent down to pick up a long, jagged piece that had fallen onto the floor. Not hesitating even for a second, she stuck the glass blade into her neck and continued to stand there like it never happened. Holy shit, Liz! I hopped up and ran to her. I grabbed her and spun her around. As soon as she saw me, she whispered, "It's here," and collapsed in my arms. She was still breathing, thankfully, only now it was short and brisk, almost like hyperventilating breaths. James never stirred in his spot through all the commotion and noise. Something truly fucked up was going on. Liz is on the small side, but she was limp and felt like she weighed a ton. I was able to get her to the couch and set her down. I should have known better, but I grabbed hold of the shard and pulled it from her neck, and blood splattered from the wound. I quickly wrapped a towel around her neck to help with the bleeding. She never made another sound after that. I began pacing in the room, muttering to myself, questioning the reality of what had just happened. I looked over at Liz, her towel now fully saturated with blood, and she was gone. She had bled out and she was dead. "It's here," her voice still fresh in my mind. What did she mean? I walked over to James and shook him. His lids finally snapped open to reveal black, soulless eyes. "Jesus, James, what the fuck?" "I'm here," he said. I fell backwards into a pile of blankets and pillows but hit my head on the edge of the table and blacked out. When I woke up, James was not in the room. I called out his name. Silence answered me. The candles were still lit, their dim flickers dancing on the walls. I wandered around the house looking for James. When I found him, he was in the bathroom staring deep into the mirror. "James, dude, what the fuck, man? What's wrong with you?" He didn't say a word, didn't move a muscle. If he was breathing, I couldn't see it. "James, who the hell is here? What do you mean?" Now he turned to me. His eyes were still dark, but I know he was seeing me standing in front of him. I felt weak while his gaze was focused on me. I heard something finally, almost from the house itself it seemed. "I am the one you called for, but I have no name." James began to scream louder than I'd heard before as I covered my ears. His screams pierced me to the core. I ran away from him, but I couldn't escape it. Like the words, the screams seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the house itself. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. As I ran past Liz's shattered mirror, I caught a glimpse of James, but he almost didn't look like him. Almost like he was shifting to someone or something else. I stopped only long enough to wrench another piece of my broken mirror from its frame and turned to defend myself against James. He continued towards me with his black eyes focused on me again. "James," I shouted. "Wake the fuck up. Liz is dead." James kept moving mindlessly, emotionless at me. "You gotta snap out of it, man. Wake up, for God's sake," I shouted. He stopped, his eyes peering into me. Then he lunged and I instinctively moved to one side and swung at him. I hit him with a sharp glass and cut him. His yell was inhuman and again came from everywhere. He landed on his side and started convulsing. "Kill me. Do it." His words travelled off. I jumped on top of James and thrusted the mirrored knife into his neck and was met with a spray of blood. "Oh God, I'm sorry, James." Whatever was there, whatever we called, was pulling at me, wanting to control me, to tear me apart from the inside. This was no human spirit. Whatever it was, we'd summoned something evil. I had to get away, or this thing would kill me too. I don't know how, but I'd be dead before morning if I didn't do something. I ran to grab my phone. Call 911? No, fuck. What are they going to do? Send a priest? I opened my phone anyway. There on screen were the instructions. We never closed the board, never said goodbye. The goddamn evil killed my best friend all because of a stupid game. I ran to the trash and pulled the board out, threw it on the floor and knelt beside it. I started crying, but through the tears I said goodbye. I'm ending the game. I'm saying goodbye to the spirits that were brought to this world. I banish any and all evil back to where it came from. I felt the evil pressing on me, wanting to destroy me still. I could feel every nerve seize from within and I froze, and then it was gone. I dialed 911 and a short time later the cops and EMS arrived to survey the situation. I was taken to the hospital for observation before going to the jail to give my version of what happened. I stood in the bathroom of my hospital room and splashed some water on my face to wake up a little. There was a knock on the door and the doctor entered. I lifted my head from the sink and stood to wipe off. I opened my eyes to check myself. Black eyes stared back at me. My wife and I have been running the rat race for years, with a family, a house in the city, 2 dogs, a cat, the stereotypical American dream. But the city took its toll. The neighbourhood got worse, the crime rose and we found ourselves looking for a way out. Our opportunity came when I was offered a new job out of state. It was a great career move, but we didn't want to move to a new city just to have the same problems again. So we started looking around and found a great mountain community about an hour and a half from the job, and a great ranch-style house with a big black porch, windows everywhere and a lot of property. The backyard has a big grassy area and a creek that cuts the property in half, then acres of woods beyond. It's huge. The house is more than twice the size of our house in the city. It's all updated and has no neighbours within a mile. It's a radical change from the life we lived in the city, but best of all, it was less than half of what we were paying for our old house. The house was a foreclosure, and when we asked the listing agent about it, she simply said the old family had abandoned this property. We really didn't think anything of it. The first 3 months were uneventful, with us settling into our new life, the kids getting used to the new school and new friends, and most of all, us getting used to the big house and property. But then the weather turned cold and things started to get weird on the property. It started with noises from the back property, things we chalked up to being in the woods. Then the motion lights around the house started going off randomly. Once again, we just chalked it up to being in the woods. But last night, it all changed. Last night was the most terrifying night of my life. One of the dogs was at the back door whining and scratching. I assumed he needed to go in the bathroom, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked out the back door. Instantly, something felt off. The dog bolted for the back property, growling and snarling. It was a cold night, about 30 degrees, but the dog plunged straight into the creek and out the other bank, running off into the woods and in the back of the property. Flashlight bouncing, I ran after him, calling his name. I got to the creek and made my way across the makeshift bridge, trying desperately to follow him. I could hear the dog still growling and barking from somewhere up ahead, and I pushed further away for the safety of the house and deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it. A shriek like I've never heard before in my life. It was a mix of a moaning wail and metal on metal. It echoed through the trees and froze me in my tracks. My dog bounded its way back to me and cowered down behind me. I turned around and could just make out the warm glow of the house behind me and the cold dark ahead of me. I swung my flashlight around wildly, looking for the source of the noise, and that's when I heard an even more terrifying noise. Out of the cold silence, my wife's voice floated all around me. "Babe," the voice called out. I whipped back around and could just barely make out the image of my wife, safely inside our house. The voice called out again. "Babe, I'm right here," came the voice from deeper into the woods. Then came another voice, just as clear as the other. It was my dad's voice. "Come out here," it called. I swung the flashlight around again and this time caught the briefest glint of light bouncing off eyes. The creature was in my beam of light for barely a second, but it was tall, maybe 6 feet, and ashen white. It had long spindly fingers that gasped the trunks of pine tree, and then it was gone. I turned back and ran towards the house. I ran headlong into the icy creek and stumbled. My dog ran past me, making it back to the yard and up to the porch. I dug my hands into the freezing muddy bank and pulled myself out, not stopping to look back. When I reached the porch, I scrambled inside. My wife ran over to me, asking what had happened. I just shook my head. I'm not certain myself what happened. I had a growing sense of dread tonight as the sun began to fall. We kept the dogs inside, and I haven't dared to look out the back. But as I sit here typing, one by one, the motion lights in the backyard keep going on. I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I'm scared beyond belief. After hearing stories and looking stuff up online, I'm fairly sure it was a Wendigo. Me, my son and girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northmost area of Washington. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger, who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and instead of confiscating our weapons, told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking myself, there's no way. They must be messing with us, but I knew better, so then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiking around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby carrying backpacks and my son started to get real heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if someone had killed a buck. There was a whole outline in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man to do. The buck or whatever it was would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tent. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, we stayed inside the tent and my girlfriend put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I woke to a faint rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance had unnaturally long limbs for a buck, and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me deep into my eyes as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me, as if it knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt towards us? Just then, this tall, decrepit, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't exactly tell what it was saying, but it seemed to have said, "I need more children." My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out, and in the morning we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing, and they started a search party. I explained what had happened, and strangely they seemed to believe it. The one who seemed to be older by at least a decade pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I am not even sure if it was what I had heard. But it sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger, when suddenly some rangers came into the cabin saying that they couldn't find our son. My girlfriend starts to sob. I start to hate myself, thinking that I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw, or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is that we don't have a son anymore. God help whoever goes into that forest next. And please, please don't bring your kids with you. This story happened to my sister, who is a travelling registered nurse. Her occupation takes her all over the Navajo Nation reservation. So most times her husband, when he is available, will drive her from and to her next shift. She worked a night shift mostly. They have never shared a ghost story before this or since. It was between 2:45 AM and 3 AM in the summertime. If you're from the res, you know that most nights are arid with a slight cool breeze. When she had finished her shift, sometime around midnight, her husband was driving. Her next job was in Chiln, so they decided to go through Kayenta. They were driving on that stretch of desolate highway between Round Rock and Lukachiku. The streetlights from the homes are scattered in the horizon miles away, apart, and most times it is just pitch black. She was half asleep, but alert because of all the caffeine in her system and the fact that she is used to being awake all night because of her job. They had not seen another vehicle for an hour or so, and were not familiar with the area, having only driven through the area a few times. She said they were driving on the roads, and in front of them, probably about a football field's length, she noticed something splattered across the 2-lane highway. She said it was dark. Roadkill or dead livestock on the road is a common thing in the reservation due to poor fencing and highway maintenance. She figured it looked familiar and not too out of place, but as they got closer, she said she remembers the shimmer of the dark matter, like wet pavement. She thought to herself, it must be recent blood splatter if it's still wet. Her eyes began darting across the landscape and trying to assess the damage, looking for the animal carcass. The blood puddle spanned the width of the highway. She thought it had been from a large animal like a cow or a horse, but she couldn't locate the large bloated carcass of any livestock. Something didn't feel quite right. As rural as the location was and how recent the seemingly wet blood was, she figured no one could have been there that quickly to dispose of the roadkill. As soon as she came to the conclusion in her head, she said her instincts took over. She felt like someone kicked her in the stomach, like the ground falling out beneath you, or the way you feel dropped in a roller coaster, but no joyous emotion. It felt bad or evil. She jolted upright and began trying to scan the dark horizon for any clues. Her husband later said he didn't want to scare her but came to the same conclusion silently by himself. She said her blood froze and her heart skipped a beat when she made out a silhouette slowly rising on the left shoulder of the highway. Her mind began to race with what it could possibly be. We haven't passed any vehicles in a long time, and we are far from the nearest residence. What could be out in the middle of nowhere this late and this isolated? It was standing upright and facing the opposite direction. Her husband began to speed up as they neared it. She doesn't want to look because everything about the situation seems wrong, and she doesn't want to see something she can't unsee. Too late. It's in her peripheral and she doesn't want to close her eyes because she said that would be more terrifying. Her eyes stay straight ahead, but her curiosity gets the best of her and her eyes wander off to the left. As the headlights hit the silhouette almost full on, she said it looked like a person standing there, wrapped in a white sheet. A white sheet that has been splattered with blood. The figure stands completely still, not flinching or shuddering from the lights of the vehicle. The figure seems to have shoulder-length black hair that looks jaggedly cut. She said the way the hair hung off the head of the figure, it looked matted or greased, and not free-flowing or clean. They are passing the figure, her husband trying to stay on the pavement but the furthest away from the left shoulder that road will allow. She can't make out the face because the figure has its head bowed down and the hands out in front of it in a prayer stance. Neither of them speak. Her mind is rushing with the thoughts like, what if the vehicle stops working, or whatever that was starts chasing us? Who would be able to help us? They make it to the intersection towards many farms, a sigh of relief. That's one of the reasons Navajo elders tell you to never drive at dark or really late. This happened to my mother, actually, and she told me about it later that night. After we moved to the middle of nowhere about a year and a half ago, I began researching paranormal as a sort of hobby, if you will. My family is an hour away from any nearby town and surrounded by sparse woods filled with dark pine and gnarled old oaks that give me the creeps. I think this fueled my research into paranormal, as it's such an unnerving setting right outside the window. I ended up stumbling across Skinwalkers one day in my research and was instantly drawn to them. I'm not sure why. Maybe the fact it was a tangible creature, I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, about a month into my odd obsession, I left at about 5 AM with my brother for the nearest town an hour away to stay with her grandparents for the night. That night my mother called to tell me about an odd encounter she had with a deer about half an hour after my brother and I left. She was home alone and had just gotten out of the shower. The sun was just starting to come up, so it was still relatively dark outside, and she heard 2 short sharp knocks on the window and the 2 family dogs started going absolutely nuts in the living room. She walked out into the living room and saw a stag, standing on its hind legs, peering into the living room window. The family dogs, otherwise good-natured and familiar with deer at this point, were snarling. Their hackles raised as she said she could see the whites of their eyes. When it turned and saw my mum standing there, she said it blew air out of its nose, fogging up the window. That's how cold it was, and dropped down onto all floors, before slowly wandering off down the driveway. My mum thought she had had a rare encounter with a deer and was excited to tell me about it since we both love animals. But it made my blood run cold and scared the crap out of me. Personally, it feels way too well timed to be a coincidence. I have stopped my research, all of it actually, into anything paranormal. We haven't had anything similar happen since, I'm glad to report. This happened in northeast Colombia in early August of 2018. The area in which this happened is on a road beside the woods with some suburban communities lying here and there. The thing is, 20 to maybe 25 years ago, the area was deep in the woods. There were no neighbourhoods, just scattered houses here and there. Here's what happened. I was driving on a quiet, overcast, gloomy day. I turned a corner and noticed the road was void of any traffic, which was strange for this time of day. I looked ahead, and about 1,000 feet in front of me was something I'd never seen before. There was this creature with an orange colour to it. Now mind you, I've been driving this road several times a week for the past 10 years, so I'm going to notice when something doesn't look right. Anyway, this thing I saw was running across the road very quickly. So fast I know it wasn't a person or even an animal, because it was running on 2 legs. I believe it had a tail, and I swear it looked like a fox or maybe even a coyote, except for the fact that those don't run on their hind legs. I feel like I should mention that there was a subdivision on the side of the road I was running toward, so I guess that's where it was determined to go. Once it got across the road, it just vanished into thin air. I'll never forget how that thing just glided across the road, and how fast it was going. The whole event only lasted maybe 3 or 5 seconds, but it felt so much longer. I didn't get eye contact with it, because it was too far away. I've heard people say that Native Americans have a better chance of seeing these things. I am part Native American and have some family that still lives on a reservation. I'm not too familiar with a lot of their practices or traditions other than what I've read in books and on the internet. If anyone here would like to help me understand what happened, it would be greatly appreciated. I've been spooked and sort of obsessed about my experience since it happened. At times I can't stop thinking about it. I have been drawn toward things that didn't even interest me before. I sometimes have dreams about the creature I saw that day. Let me know if you or someone else has had some. So I posted my experience a few weeks ago and got some good feedback. I was even asked about some other stories and experiences I might have had. So I asked around my family to see what I could find. My dad's side of the family is majority Navajo, and I definitely did not come up short with experiences and stories. This story came from my great-grandmother and takes place on an old reservation in Arizona about 32 years ago. She had a pretty decent sized property. On this property, she had three hogans, a large cornfield adjacent to 3 hogans, a large well on the opposite side of the cornfield, and a grazing pasture for her 12 sheep and 4 horses. At the end of the day, she would take a horse and herd the sheep into a small pen closer to the house. While telling the story, this is where she got uneasy. She would keep nervously scratching her neck and looking around. She said that one day she told everyone she was going out to herd the sheep as usual. She hopped on her favourite horse and found the sheep probably a mile or so away from the house. She counted 11 sheep, so she started to search for the other by making circles around the area, increasing the diameter of each circle as she progressed. She found the last sheep up on the hill from the herd, standing alone in the open. She spurred her horse and started trotting over. When she got closer, she said she started to notice whatever she was seeing was definitely not a sheep. At the same time, she noticed her horse stopped in its tracks and its ears perked up. She said that the way it was standing gave it away, and the wool of the sheep didn't look right, almost like it had been taped on and was starting to fall off to one side. It was hard for me to believe what happened next, but she said that it stood up and turned around. It was an old medicine man with a sheepskin cloak, but this isn't what she had seen before. He stared at her, and she said the bloodlust in his eyes made her want to cry and hide. The horse reared up at the sight of this, throwing her to the ground, and she blacked out. Now, this is where I started to believe the story. A few hours later, my father, grandfather, and uncle hopped on their horses and rode out to look for her. They found a herd of sheep and started to panic when she wasn't nearby. They followed the tracks up the hill and found her unconscious in the snow. Her horse had been slaughtered. A section of its throat was missing, and it had multiple scratch wounds on its chest and front legs that my grandfather said had to be at least 1.5 inches deep. Around my grandmother is a perfect circle where footprints and handprints, like someone had been trotting around her on all fours. My grandfather was emphasized that it was a perfect circle. My grandmother doesn't remember waking up or being sick for 2 weeks after the encounter, but my father, uncle and grandfather told me that they spent those weeks questioning her sanity, puking up unusual green fill smelling liquid and having sporadic fevers. I asked all of them at different times after my grandmother told the story. My uncle and father live in different parts of Arizona, and my grandfather split from my grandmother, but they all told me pretty much the same story about what took place afterwards. I even got some other experiences from them. I have no way of proving this is true, but after seeing my grandmother get so uncomfortable telling the story 30 years later, I believe it with all my soul. I was only 11 at the time of this story. My family has property in Blanding, Utah, that we like to use for camping and other fun stuff. My grandma and I were driving back home after spending the weekend down there. We got to Monticello when I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the closest building we saw was a pottery store, so we stopped there. It was evening time as I remember the sun setting. Before going inside, I saw an older woman standing across the street with a huge walking stick. I waved at her because I thought the stick looked cool, and she smiled and waved back. After coming back outside, she was gone, but in the distance I could see a deer prancing away. I was bummed because I wanted to see the stick closer because it looked like it had carvings and other things hanging from the top. As we were about 2 hours further into our drive home, it was super dark and we were driving through a canyon, when all of a sudden I had this massive sense of something watching me. I looked out of the window and could barely see a big deer running on the hillside, keeping pace with our car. I was excited and told my grandma to slow down and look because it really was a massive looking deer. When she slowed down, I was pointing at it. I swear it locked eyes with me, and for some reason I had a feeling of familiarity. But also like I had a feeling of familiarity, but also like my heart was going to jump from my body. The familiar feeling was akin to seeing someone from elementary school, but not quite sure I actually knew them. My grandma told me she couldn't see anything, which I thought was crazy, but she told me to just get some rest as she continued to speed up. I have told this story to a few friends and they didn't think it was all too interesting, but after all these years I can still remember both what the woman looked like and the deer almost as if they were standing in front of me. It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog Lucy barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter, staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there rummaging around. I thought she was just freaking out over a house noise. We'd only had her for 3 months and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything: our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best bet would be to open the door and show her nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but it's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured it should work with a puppy too. I opened the door and she raced to the front door. She stood there, snarling at the door. It was an angry, violent growl, one I'd never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her that everything was okay. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumping towards me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered, almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerism changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. And outside were two kids. One was just a smidgen shorter than me, and didn't look much younger. I'm 21, and she looked to be 16 or maybe 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a long shade of honey blonde, and she wore it long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking olive-coloured pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a small girl, who looked to be around 3 or 4, in the same style jeans and button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one looked at the floor shyly, but had the same shade of hair, tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one my daughter has, as was their style of dress. Had it not been for the feeling of overwhelming dread and fear, I probably would have asked these children in and given them some tea or hot chocolate to get them out of the bitter cold. Something about them seemed off. At this point, I hadn't made any noise, I hadn't shushed the dog or grumbled. Nothing. I hadn't turned on any lights. These kids had no indicators that I was at the door. The older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and accentless. She held her head tilted downward, and I couldn't see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that was when I saw her eyes. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black, or midnight blue, or a dark, dark purple. They were otherworldly. She said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who always been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I have never been one to believe in these things, as a staunch atheist and skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I had written off many a ghost story from friends and family members eager to tell their tale. I didn't believe it, but still I couldn't rationalise my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and a black-eyed kid. There was no question what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door, Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us in to use your phone." I took another step back, and with that step the tone changed. At first she seemed polite. When I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have broken in. I'll ask again, may we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door, and I inched backward, though something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back towards the door. It wasn't a physical pulling so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I got to my room, covered up the window, unlocked the door, and sat there in the dim light of the nightlight. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about them that black-eyed children can't just come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I still fear I'll be an exception. When I told my husband, he said it was just a dream. He keeps telling me to forget about it, but there's a lingering feeling of sadness. There's dread when the house is silent at night. There's fear of a knock at the door. This tells me otherwise. I was riding the bus back home after work. It was about 1 a.m. I am a security guard and often work odd hours. So I'm sitting there and this guy gets on, sits across from me. He was wearing a suit, had a briefcase, regular looking guy in his 20s. What struck me about him at first was that he was chewing a cigar, not smoking it. You can't smoke on the bus. So I was just looking at him while he stared out of the window and chewed his cigar. And all of a sudden he turned and looked at me. His eyes were pitch black, just as you described. My heart started beating like a madman and I felt my gorge rising. I was starting to panic and had no idea why. I was just shittingly terrified of this guy. Then he grinned at me, and his teeth were all covered in tobacco bits and brown juice. The cigar clamped between them. But instead I had the presence of mind to just get up and take the seat right behind the driver. I calmed down a bit after that, but I kept an eye on the guy. He ended up chatting with some girl that got on, and they were still talking when I got off. I later convinced myself that he was trolling me, having fun with a pair of contacts. But now I kind of wonder. This is so funny. I've never heard of black-eyed kids before my instant, so I come on here to post my story, and the first story I see is about black-eyed kids. Kinda weird, right? Let me preface this by saying I'm by no means a writer, just a domestic engineer, living in North Texas. Also, I don't believe in the paranormal, ghosts, demons, aliens, or whatever. However, I did have an event happen to me this Halloween, I have to admit, has me scratching my head. This is my first post on Reddit, and sorry to say I'd never even heard about it until yesterday. I told my best friend about my incident and she is an avid reader of No Sleep, and she told me if I didn't post it, she would. So here I am. Anyway, I hope you like. So it had been a slow trick-or-treat night in our neighbourhood that evening, which is pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas dropped off in ours and have constant parade at our door. That night I'd say we had no more than 8 or 10 groups of kids come by the entire night. It was about 9:30 p.m. and my husband and I were sitting in our family room watching some of those ghost shows based on supposedly actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that stuff, but I do like a good story now and then, and it was Halloween after all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over half an hour, and it was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light off and let our dog Chloe out of her crate. Chloe is an American bulldog and is very docile. We only put her in the crate because we were afraid she'd try and get out to play with all the kids, and I didn't want to have to chase after her down the street. Also, we didn't want her to scare any of the kids because she would look a little intimidating to the younger kids. So I turned the outside light off to let Chloe out and she followed me back to the couch and lay down at my feet. It was getting close to 10 p.m. when my husband decided he'd had enough fun for the night and was going to go upstairs, take a shower and get ready for bed. After all, it was a Thursday and he still had to get up early the next day. My teenager son was out with his friends at a local haunted house and wasn't expected back for another hour or so that left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, just because I don't believe doesn't mean those shows don't freak me out a bit, and being alone now watching, I'd have to say it was kind of on edge, as it were. It wasn't long after I heard the upstairs water for the shower turn on when there came a light, knock, knock, knock at the front door. My initial reaction was, what the hell, really? It's almost 10, just go home. But soon an uneasy feeling came over me. Why the knock? Our doorbell glows and in the dark and without the porch light it would be extra obvious to anyone there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door has a big beveled glass panel and anybody right at the door could see in enough to see someone was in the family room watching TV. It would be pretty rude for me just to sit there and not answer it. Knock, 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 again from the front door. I glanced down at Chloe and she was gone. My gaze followed her usual path to the front door, expecting her to be on her way there as she normally does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up to look around the room better and found her, crouching by the back door like she was wanting out. However, she never asks to go out like that. She always comes and licks my hand or puts her head on my knee. This was totally out of character for her, and I have to say heightened my anxiety. "Chloe, great," I said. She just turned back to look at me like, "Hell no, lady, I ain't moving." I yelled up to my husband, but if he was already in the shower, I knew there was no chance of him hearing me. Knock, 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 and cast just enough light on the door to where I could see the silhouettes of two small children through the glass. I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids, probably a couple of my neighbours on their way back home that wanted to stop by and show me their costume or something. I headed to the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't going to follow. What a great watchdog, I thought to myself as she just sat there. I turned on the porch light when I got to the door, and sure enough, I could see through the glass that it was a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and I began to wonder about what kind of parents will let their kids run the streets that late at night. I only opened the door enough to where I could block Chloe's escape if she decided to grow some balls, which was only about 2 feet away. What struck me immediately as odd was the kids weren't wearing any costumes. They were in normal street clothes, also no customary trick or treat either. I began to feel very uneasy again. It was a girl and a boy. The girl to my left was older, I'd say about 11 or 12. I could tell she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features as our lights are from high above and on columns at the front of the porch, so most of the light was coming from behind them. I had not opened the door wide enough for any light from inside to hit them directly. The boy was younger and about a foot shorter, I'd say maybe 8 or 9, and looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke up. "Ma'am, can we please come inside and use your phone to call our mum?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own these days? I couldn't remember the last time I had anybody ask to use my home phone. Hun, don't you have a phone of your own you can call your mum on?" I asked. This was when things got, weird. So both kids turned to look at one another like they were going to say something to one another. But neither ever spoke. They both turned back to me and the girl said, "Ma'am, my cell phone battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we please come inside and call our mother? We're alone out here and my brother is scared." I have to admit there were two competing feelings going on inside me. The first, that of a mother's heart that wanted to help these two small children get to their mum. The other, a sinking fear in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was then that I noticed that during the short conversation I had already opened the door a few extra inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number and I can call her myself?" Another pause, and they again looked at one another. After a short moment they turned back to me and the girl said, "Ma'am, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come inside while you call our mum?" And with that last statement, the little girl moved closer towards the door like she was going to just walk in on by me. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from inside the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, jet black eyes. That's all I could see. That motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror I don't think I've ever felt in my life. I could feel every hair on my arm and back of my neck standing at attention. I closed the door to where just my face was able to stick out. The little girl stopped and again pleaded, "Please, ma'am, we're really scared alone out here. We have to come inside. Please help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when the fear took over and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mum if you give me the number," I shouted through the door. "But I'm not letting you in my house." I could still see them stand there on the porch, just staring at me through beveled glass pane. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to my husband, but the bigger part of me didn't want to lose track of where they were. That would have freaked me out even more, to not know where they were. After what seemed like forever, but probably only a few seconds, I decided I'd call my neighbour that lives across the street. As I made my way to the side table by our couch to my phone, I glanced at the back door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest room under the bed. When I got to my phone and started to look for his contact info, it was only then that the kids stepped away from the door and began to walk down the street. As they did, I walked to the door to get a better look to see where they went, still not calling my neighbour. If you get close enough to the glass, you can see out enough to make out people's shapes, but you can't see much detail. Of course, standing that close to the door would make you pretty obvious to anyone outside looking in. From the door, I could see that the kids were still standing under the street lamp nearest my house, staring at me. As I lifted the phone to my ear after calling, only then did the kids start walking down our street. I met my neighbour out under the lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff, and I've never heard about black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. What I really think, well, what I have to think, is that these kids were just out yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say this for them, they were good. Really good at it. They scared the crap out of me and my dog. This really freaked me out. Yesterday, I noticed my neighbour hadn't put out all of his Halloween decorations and lights. The past 2 years I've lived next to him, he's gone all out for Halloween. I don't know him well, he's younger, single, but I know he likes kids, but not in a creepy way. His brother and sister-in-law and their kids are always visiting him, and he plays with his 3 young nieces and nephews out in the yard. So anyway, I got home from work and was walking up my driveway and saw him outside and said something like, "Hey man, you better get your Halloween stuff up or that house up the street is going to beat you for the best decorations." He kind of smiles sheepishly and says that he's actually going to keep his house dark this year and just put candy out. I asked if he was going out of town, but he said no. Something happened last year that really scared him. Now I was concerned for my own safety if some weirdos were coming around our neighbourhood, which is a pretty safe neighbourhood with tons of young families living here. So I asked him what happened. He said last year he had his brother's family over so they could trick or treat in the neighbourhood since they live in an apartment complex that doesn't do much for Halloween. He had a bunch of kids come to the door like always. His family took off around 10:30 and there were only a few older trick-or-treaters. But by 11:30 they were pretty much done. So he was inside watching TV and the doorbell rings. He grabs the candy bowl and heads over, noticing that it's a little past midnight and that's pretty rude for trick-or-treaters still be out. But then noticed he hadn't turned off all his decoration lights yet, so his house is still a beacon. He swings the door open and is about to yell boo or something to freak them out, but stops dead when he sees the kids at the door. He said one was probably around 13 or 14 and the other around 16 or 17, both male. They weren't dressed up, but he remembers the older one was wearing a flannel checkered shirt. He was immediately overcome with uneasiness, like opening the door was a huge mistake. They just stared at him and he noticed they had really big irises and dilated pupils. He couldn't even see the whites of their eyes, so he figured they were contact lenses. He was frozen there holding the candy bowl, like he couldn't slam the door in their face as much as he wanted to. So he nervously tried to smile at them, hoping they would break character and ask for candy or something. The younger one said that he had gotten lost and needed to come in and use his phone. That was when he closed the door more than halfway on them and said, "No, sorry." And the older one said something like, can we just come in your house until our parents come and get us? But by then he was convinced that his life was in danger, and these kids must be high on something, or intending to rob him, and he just kept mumbling, "No, sorry, good night," as he inched the door closed and locked it. He told me he was so scared at that point that they were going to try and break in through one of his windows or something, but he looked through the peephole and they had turned to leave. He watched TV with the volume really low so he could hear any sounds at all, and he said he stayed up till about 5 AM because he was too scared to go to bed and drop his guard. The whole time he's telling me this, I'm thinking, oh my god, this sounds so familiar, just like the Black-Eyed Kids urban legend. Then I thought, hey, maybe this dude is trying to scare me because after all, he does have the Halloween spirit. So I'm looking at him, incredulously, but try not to seem too gullible. So I'm like, man, that is really crazy, sounds like the Black-Eyed Kids. He just looks at me blankly. The what? Is that a movie or something? And I said no, but told him to go look it up online. Like an hour later I get a knock on my door, and immediately almost jump out of my skin thinking it the demon child. It was my neighbour, and his eyes were freaking huge. He swears to me up and down that he had never heard of Black-Eyed Kids before, and it's so similar to what happened to him. So we talked a while longer, and I told him that quite a few people probably know about that urban legend, and it's possible it was just teenagers with black contacts trying to freak people out on Halloween, which would be genius by the way. But he said the fear he felt was so primal and came over him the second he opened the door for them. The incident took place about 13 years ago. I had just moved to a new city with my wife. We were small town newlyweds from the Midwest. We moved cross country to one of the biggest cities in the southwest so I could attend graduate school. Being naive and used to city living, I habitually answered the door without a second thought, but never again after this. The first thing that should have tipped me off was the peculiarity of the situation was the fact that someone was knocking at 6 in the morning. The second thing that should have dawned on me is that this kid had to reach over a rather tall patio gate and latch and open it. The knock at the door was startling. My wife and I were getting ready for work, a pretty normal routine. The moment I opened the door, I was overtaken with an inexplicable sense of fear. To this day I can picture him. Teenager, average height, average build, knee-length black leather coat, short black hair and sunglasses. The sunglasses at 6 AM struck me as odd, and even more odd, he was eating an apple. He was very polite and asked if he could come in and warm up. I said no, and closed the door and slid the security chain into place. A moment later, there was another knock. I opened the now chained door, and before I could speak, he asked again if he could come in and warm up. No, I replied, and attempted to close the door. Before the door could shut, he put his hand out, stopping the door on its hinges. He looked directly into my eyes, still wearing his sunglasses, and said, "Can I at least get some ketchup for my apple?" "Fuck that," I replied, albeit a little confused. "Get the hell out of here, my wife is calling the police." He takes a moment to let the information sink in, lowers his glasses, revealing eyes as black as obsidian, and says, "No, you won't be calling anybody." At that moment I force the door closed, lock it, and call out to my wife. She is terrified, hiding in the bedroom, all jacked up on adrenaline. I rip the curtains back to look out the window next to the door. He's gone. Absolutely no trace of him. I go out onto the patio and check the gate. It's still latched from the inside. That was messed up, I think to myself as I turned to enter the house. I noticed half an eaten apple lying on the ground. I work in security at Disney World, the happiest place on earth. Typically, I wouldn't say where I work, as obviously there are some pretty strict rules about things employees can put online. But I just don't think I can tell this properly without that context. And honestly, I think this may be it for me anyway with this job. I just can't see myself working here any longer now. I've been with the company for 23 years. The first 20 years I worked in the parks, nabbling shoplifters and rounding up people who were drinking too much for the heat. Occasionally there'd be a fight to break up, but people usually kept it pretty mild. The heat and walking was getting too much for me the last few years, so I asked to be transferred somewhere with AC, and the company moved me to one of their resorts. Well, the working conditions were 110% better as far as climate and comfort go. The guest issues were trickier, mainly domestics. I guess the expensive and stress of vacation got to a lot of people, and I'd be called by neighbouring rooms because some mum and dad were yelling at each other. I'd try to suggest they take a nap or go do separate activities for a bit, and that would usually calm them down. But none of that is what I'm here for. I've got to get this out while I have time. 3 days ago, I got a call from management. Apparently, a couple of days before that, housekeeping had went into a room that shouldn't have been turned over that day. Turned over is when one guest leaves by about 11 AM and the next guest checks in around 3. And all of the guests' items were still in the room. Housekeeping made a note of it and moved on. But during the next 2 days when they entered the room, everything was still there and untouched. I went to check it out and sure enough, there was an empty room full of luggage, clothes, snacks and some toys. Everything a family would need for a vacation. The manager had already looked up the previous reservation and it was for a family, a dad, a mum and 2 little kids. I tried to call the phone number they had given, but all I got was a voicemail. We were a bit stumped, so I made the call that housekeepers could clean the room and take the family's personal items to be held until we got in contact with someone. I went digging into the reservation more. The family had arrived 5 days before housekeeping discovered all of their stuff. I found that the family had paid a parking fee and their vehicle description was listed. A quick walk off the parking lot and I had easily located their vehicle. So that ruled out a car accident or them deciding to just leave all of their stuff behind. Next, I saw that they had bought a dining plan. This was when a guest prepays for all their food. They're given a certain amount of credits to use for meals. This family had only used 3 credits, and the last one was 2 days after they checked in. It appeared that the day they arrived, they got here late and probably just stayed on the resort. The next day they used 2 credits at Epoch. The second park day they used just 1 credit at Magic Kingdom, and it was at breakfast time. Now at Disney we have something called magic bands. Magic bands are worn by the guests and act as a room key, park ticket, credit card, dining reservation payment and fast pass, which is a system used to bypass lines. It took some work, but I was finally able to look up the family's fastpass history. The day they went to Magic Kingdom, they had breakfast at a restaurant in the park, rode a couple of rides and then rode their last ride. It's a small world around 11 AM, then nothing. Finally, it was time to bring in someone else on this. I called an old co-worker at Magic Kingdom and asked him to pull security footage for It's a Small World at the time they wrote it, and I made my way over there. When I got there, my friend was very confused, almost distraught looking. He showed me what he had found. There's usually a camera in the direction of where the rides load and unload. The footage showed them scanning their bands to use fast passes for the ride and boarding the ride. The footage from the exit on the ride just showed the other people in their car exiting, but they weren't there. Of course we thought the worst. Maybe one of the kids had fallen out and mum and dad and the other kid got off in the middle of the ride to help, and they all got injured or killed or stuck in machinery or something. So we shut down the ride, middle of the damn day. Turned off the earworm music and turned up the lights. Me and my buddy walked that ride 3 times before we called in help. Eventually, there was close to 10 cast members searching, and we didn't find anything, except for 3 cell phones and a hat. I was stumped. I've kept digging the past couple of days, and I'm not sure who to tell what I found next. I've called the police and I suppose they're on the way, but the company has a way of covering up things like this, and I decided I can't live with myself if I don't put out some type of warning. I kept digging into their reservation over the last couple of days, and today I noticed they had purchased Memory Maker. There are photographers all over the parks and cameras in a lot of rides, and with Memory Maker the photos are all free. They automatically get added to a guest Disney account when the system knows their picture has been taken. And the system always knows. Everyone's whereabouts are always known with the magic bands. Well, I opened up their Memory Maker photo album and I swear there's 732 pictures. I opened up their Memory Maker photo album and I swear the first 30 or so are pretty normal. Epcot, a few rides in front of the castle, but the rest are all in It's a Small World. The rides only take one picture per go round, so it appears as though this family had ridden the ride over 700 times. The first picture was pretty normal. Everyone looked happy, it was a busy day and a full car of guests. The next one is rough to look at. The car is empty except for this little family, and it looks so darn confused. The next 10 to 15, I can see Dad getting angry, yelling. Mum is holding on to these two kids like her life depends on it, and you can see the kids getting increasingly upset, crying. And it goes on, and on, and on. After 50 or so, it looks like they're trying to get out. It's one the dad is missing, and another they're all gone. Maybe like they've bailed early in the ride and tried to walk out. But in the very next one, they're all right back in that damn car. After around 450 or so, I only see the mum and kids. It's just when I look closely I can see Dad, maybe just his body now, slumped down in one of the other seats. Since about 675, there's just mum and one kid, another body in another seat. The mum and kids aren't moving anymore. I think them two are still alive, just damn near catatonic, looking straight ahead, pale, and y'all, I swear on my life, the dolls are moving or something. In some of these pictures I can tell they aren't where they should be. I even saw one with a doll in the car with this family. I can't look anymore or I'm going to lose my lunch. I closed the album, its file size has increased since I closed it. God, are there new pictures being added? I see on security cameras that the local PD just arrived, so they'll take over soon. I wish I knew what was going on, but I also wish this damn thing had never landed in my lap. I don't think I'll be able to update this. After I talk to the police, I think I'm going to walk out of here and never come back. I just wanted to get this out there before Disney feeds the media some cover-up as to why the family vanished. They didn't vanish. I know where they are. My neighbour is one of those wannabe YouTube personalities. Over the years, I've seen him cough out cinnamon, lay flat on the hood of his car as it slowly creeps down the driveway, and douse himself in lukewarm water, all the while screaming epic win, epic fail, or epic maintenance of the status quo, for all I know. It can get tiring to watch him go about his shenanigans in the pursuit of viral fame. So when he knocked on my door the other day, told me he was going away for a few weeks, and asked that I get his mail, honestly, it was a relief. I can't explain the peace of mind I had knowing I didn't have to brace myself for another of his stupidity for a while. I was always afraid his stunts would wind up bleeding over into my life. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of days. He received a few bills, a bit of spam, and what I could only assume was a birthday card. Then one evening, I got home to find a cardboard box waiting on his front porch. In big red letters was written, "Return to sender." I'm no small fry, but I admit I had trouble lifting the box on my own. It was really heavy. Lugging it across the road to my house was even harder. And I quickly realised there was no way I was going to drag it up the stairs and through my front door. so I decided to leave his package in my garage. It wasn't like I kept my car in there. The garage door was a piece of rubbish anyway that refused to open without a good thug and a whack. It was less trouble just leaving the car in the driveway than it was to fight with the garage door every morning and night. In hindsight, I should have set the package down while I struggled to open the tricky door. But you know how it is when you've got a good grip of something. No point in setting it down if you don't have to. It was as I kicked the door for a third time that I lost my grip on the package, and it fell to the ground. I heard a light crack inside. Shit, I cursed. I hope I hadn't broken anything important. But I figured I just wouldn't tell my neighbour about it and let him assume the break happened en route. Hands free, I finally managed to get the garage door unstuck. And boy, did it screech in protest as it rolled up and over me. I dragged the box the rest of the way, setting it in a corner for whenever my neighbour would come back to claim it. And then I forgot all about it. Until a few days passed, that is. I'm not sure exactly how long it took for the smell to waft from the crack under the garage door to my house, but it came in a slow progression. It was a sticky, sweet odour, similar to a skunk, and for the first few days after I smelled it, I genuinely assumed that that's exactly what it was. Roadkill that had left its mark on my house. It was only when I realised the scent was growing more intense instead of fading that I went looking for a source. That's when I opened the garage door, and that's when the odour knocked me back, holding my nose. The culprit wasn't hard to identify. The only change in my garage was the box in the corner. I remember thinking it must have been one of those meat of the month subscription boxes. The meat must have gone rancid from being left out of the fridge for so long. How much meat could have been in there for a box to have been so large and heavy? An entire cow, perhaps. I covered my nose as I approached the box, a pair of scissors in my hands. I probably wouldn't have needed them to open it, as it had become soggy enough at the bottom to poke through with a finger. But it wasn't about to poke my finger into spoiled meat juices. That soggy bottom was the reason I had to open the box in the first place. If I tried to drag it out whole, everything would spill onto the floor. I was going to have to dump the pieces of meat one garbage bag at a time, and take them down to the dumpsters, a process I was not looking forward to. My scissors tore through the tape along the top of the cardboard box. I thought the smell wouldn't get any worse, but as I flipped the flaps open, I discovered a whole new garment of stink. It was like opening a burning oven. But instead of a heat wave, I was met with waves of pee, sweat and feces. It was so bad that I staggered back and had to force down a puke, begging to guzzle out of me. I don't think I could have handled the scent mingling with the horrors coming out of the box. I'm not ashamed to admit I ran out of the door for a breath of fresh air, but in the short time I'd spent in the garage, the smell had become so ingrained in the fabric of my clothes that I clung to me like a shadow. Nothing I tried could keep the smell out of my nostrils. Not air fresheners, not a face mask, not 3 showers and a change of clothes. Every second that box lay open in my garage was another second the smell was allowed to foothold in my home. I had to bite the bullet. So I returned to the garage, the flaps of the box still open as though inviting me back to look. I was prepared, a clothespin pinning my nostrils shut, a garbage bag in one hand, the strongest cleaner I could find in the other, and long rubber gloves to keep my skin from having to touch what was inside. But as it turns out, I needed none of those things. What was inside, I wouldn't have to touch or clean the contents of that box. I would only have to suffer the nightmare every night. You see, there was meat in that box, but it didn't come from a cow or a pig. Oh no. It was worse than that. It was my neighbour, dead, still in one piece, but very much dead. I called the cops and naturally they took me in for interrogation. It's kind of hard not to suspect the man with a corpse in the garage after all. Thankfully they soon realised I wasn't involved, My DNA might have been all over that box, the smell might have left a mark throughout my house, but there was one piece of irrefutable evidence in my neighbour's own hands that provided my innocence: a vlogging camera. They showed me the footage only once. I'm not sure if they were allowed to, or if they felt so bad for me they figured it couldn't hurt. Either way, I saw it. My neighbour was sitting in the box outside of a shipping facility, laughing as he told the world how he was going to mail himself across state lines. He brought pee bottles, food, a pillow, and a few flashlights. His friend, a guy I'd seen at his place several times to help with his stunts, closed the lid and presumably dropped him off for shipment. Throughout the next couple of hours, or days, I'm honestly not sure, my neighbour recorded a few short clips about his progress. I think I'm in a truck now, I can feel it moving. Must be in a warehouse, pretty warm here. Still got plenty of food though. You know, that kind of stuff. And then on the last entry, the box toppled over. He broke his neck, and that was it. The camera recorded until either the memory card got too full or the battery died. There's one thing I didn't tell the police after they showed me the video. One thing I heard in the footage that will haunt me to the day I die. Just after the tumble that broke his neck, I heard the familiar screeching sound of my garage door. One of my least favourite parts about being a middle school teacher is the not so incredible living history assignment we give at the end of every school year. Kids are supposed to sit with their grandparents and videotape, voice record or transcribe their oldest memories for posterity, and for an easy way to bring up their GPA. I've been doing this for 17 years, and when I collected the projects this time around, I assumed they would be as dull, if not duller than usual. This had not been a particularly bright class. So I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and prepared for a long night of, I only owned 2 pairs of pants when I was your age, and my brother got beat with a newspaper for hitting a baseball into our neighbour's yard. And of course, these projects were prepared with innocent old person comments that were so horribly sexist and racist that you just had to laugh. Now, I had a girl in my class whom I will call Olivia. She was pudgy, quiet, and proved herself consistent B student. I expected her project to be as unremarkable as her, and perhaps that's why I was so profoundly disturbed by what I witnessed that night. Olivia had submitted 2 discs for some reason, so I began with the one marked interview. My screen hiccuped twice before a grainy image of a living room came into view. The place was a hoarder's hell. Olivia was curled up in an armchair, clutching a notebook and looking like a scared animal. Across from her sat a man with sombre countenance, smoking a cigarette and staring at her expectantly. "Go ahead," a woman's voice whispered from behind the camera. Olivia's owlish eyes flashed towards the screen, then back to the man. "I'm here with Great Uncle Stephen," she began almost inaudibly. "He is going to tell us about his oldest memories from being in the army." Great Uncle Stephen looked like he'd rather be in a goddamn trench at the moment, but he waited patiently for the questions to begin. Not surprisingly, Olivia read verbatim from the suggested question sheet I had handed out to students. He answered her curtly. Once or twice I heard her mother whisper, "Speak up, Olivia," from behind the camera. Typical boring stuff. So I was intrigued when Olivia sat down the notebook and asked, "Did you like being in the army?" That was totally off script. Great Uncle Stephen emitted a chain smoker's wheeze. "Nope, glad to get out of my town though." "Where did you go?" "Balkans." "Uh-huh," she said. I doubted she knew where the Balkans were, and my suspicion was confirmed when she asked, "Was the Balkis very different from here?" "Yes." Mum cleared her throat from behind the camera, perhaps encouraging Great Uncle Stephen to be a little more forthcoming. But Olivia seemed genuinely interested. "Uncle Stephen," she asked, "what is your very worst memory from the army?" The old man crushed his cigarette in the ashtray and then slowly lifted himself out of the chair. "I'll be back," he mumbled. The camera cut off. When the screen flashed back on, everything was the same, except Great Uncle Stephen had several pieces of paper in plastic sleeves laid atop of all the crap sitting on his coffee table. One he held in his hand. "I was a kid when I enlisted," he said, looking at Olivia. "Your brother's age," he told her. Olivia nodded. "I never saw combat. Both of my deployments were to cities in Eastern Europe that had been destroyed by civil wars. Everything was a mess. I felt like a janitor for Mum coughed. Great Uncle Stephen sighed and looked at his paper. "My unit was assigned to a school that had been obliterated by all the violence. Broken windows, caved-in rooms, and for some reason, the part that got to me the most was the school had been like this for years before we got there. No one had lifted a finger to fix it. I saw kids walk by it on their way to go beg for money or whatever shift they did." The camera dipped to the floor as I heard Mum whisper harshly at Great Uncle Stephen. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it wasn't hard to imagine. "Do you want to hear the goddamn story or not?" I heard him bark in response. "Then you better let me tell it how I want." "Mum," Olivia chimed, "please stop interrupting." "Are you presenting this in front of your class?" "No, Mum, we are just handing it in to our teacher." "I'm sure he's heard the word shit before," Great Uncle Stephen contributed helpfully. It wasn't a he as a matter of fact, but other than that, the statement was accurate. The camera was lifted, and after a couple of blurry focus adjustments, the shot was the same as before. "I'm talking too much anyway," he grumbled. He lifted a piece of paper in his hand close to his face. "In the basement I found this letter. I don't know what it said, but I had a buddy of mine translate it, so I'm going to read it now. And then I'll tell you what I saw in the basement." A chill ran down my spine. Mum zoomed in to Great Uncle Stephen and his letter. His palsied hands trembled as he held up the paper, and this is what it read. "Dear Sir, I never loved my country. So many of these skirmishes are born from patriotism, our power struggle for the shards of a once great empire. But I do not care what name my home has on the map. This fighting is senseless, and I stay as far away from it as I can. It was not these attacks or disorganized violence that took the lives of my wife and child. It was illness. Mercifully, it happened quickly for the baby. Nadja suffered for longer. I watched in horror, knowing I could do nothing for them. My only solace is that I was there for them every step of the way. I stopped going to work one day, and no one came after me. I doubt they noticed I was gone, since the school was simply across a field. Visible from my window, it would have been easy to go for a few hours each day and come back quickly to care for them. But what was the point? All I did was clean floors. I was as useless to the world as I was to my family. I tried to take Nadja to the hospital, but the journey was too long and taxing. I brought her home and she died that night. After Nadja and the baby were gone, well, I don't remember much. I didn't leave my hovel, barely ate and slept. Thought many times of taking my own life. Tempting though it was, I felt paralysed by my own helplessness. The one thing that kept me sane was my radio. I never turned it off once. Even though I didn't listen to the words being said, in fact, the channel I got the clearest was in English, I think. Which I didn't speak a lick of, but the voices, the music, and the true knowledge that life existed beyond this violent city sustained me. I have no idea how long passed before I saw the light of day again. I was dizzy from hunger, so finding food was my priority. My radio came with me, of course. Since I first holed myself up, it has gone everywhere with me. It talks to me as I sleep and as I wake. I don't know what it's saying, but I know I would die without it. Once I had some water and food, it occurred to me that the only thing left to do was to go back to work. So I did. The following morning, I simply returned to the school where I was a janitor and got back to work. Nobody made a big deal out of it. Like I said, Nadja has been sick for a long time, and those who worked at the school knew that. I appreciate that no one had pestered me to come back to work during the hardest days of my life. The teachers never said much to me, but we smiled at each other in the halls, and the mutual respect was perhaps the reason I decided to come back at all. The place had gone to the dogs without me, so I simply grabbed my broom and rags from my closet and set to cleaning. Everyone is grateful to have me back, I know, and the best part is that nobody minds the radio. I bring it with me everywhere and keep the volume low enough not to disrupt the students. No one has ever complained. In fact, I suspect they like it. The schoolhouse is not very big, but does require a lot of maintenance. The floors are always sticky and stained, so I spend most of my time mopping. Kids make messes. I guess that's why I'm still in business. Sometimes I have to move things around to make sure I get every spot on the floor beautiful and clean, but I take pride in that. And the repairs, well, the school always needs tune-ups here and there, and I am happy to help. Some days I am reconstructing a desk that broke as I whistle along with the radio. Other times I handle more serious structural issues. Days when I have work like this, I feel truly instrumental, like a cog in a larger machine. How could the school survive without me? It took me a long time, but I once again feel like I have purpose. There is a larder behind the school that is full of preserved food. In lieu of payment, I am allowed to take as much food as I need. The arrangement is fine. What would I do with money anyway? I used to bring the food back to my home, just one field away from the school, but when I started sleeping in the basement, no one seemed to notice. This school is special to me and I cannot leave it unguarded. When I am besieged with memories of my wife and baby, I turn up the volume on the radio to drown out such thoughts. It works for me every time. Except this morning. Because this morning I woke up to dead silence. I frantically examined the radio to see what had happened. I honestly cannot tell you how many days in a row I have been using it. Did it simply live out its life and die naturally? I have spent the entire day trying to fix it. Most of the time, I have been crying. I am losing my mind without it. I have given myself until sundown. If I cannot fix it by then, I am going to take my life. I am writing this because the sunlight is starting to die and I know what my fate shall be. I have thought about taking one last walk through the halls of my school, saying goodbye to the students and teachers. I know I will be missed, but I cannot bring myself to leave this room. I cannot go anywhere knowing that my radio is dead in here. There are no more tears in me. It feels now like I can't catch my breath. I vomited what little food I had in my stomach and I am growing dizzy again, like I did after Nadja died. I am not long for this world, but before I take my life, I have closed the door to the room and stuck a chair beneath the handle. It is the only room in the basement and has a small casement that lets in just enough light for me to see what I am doing. If anyone is kind enough to come looking for me, they should not be met with this gruesome sight. Perhaps they will see the door is blocked, smell rotting body and simply forget I ever existed. But I have placed both my radio and note outside the door. Kind sir, if you are reading this, I have one humble request. Please fix it. Save my radio. I did not deserve to die in its sleep, and I am ashamed that I cannot revive it. Now I am ready to join Nadja and little Ludmila in heaven. We hope this school can find another janitor who loves and cares for it the way I did. The hour is now. Do not forget my radio. Stanislav. When Mum zoomed back out, Olivia had tears in her eyes. Thank you for sharing, Uncle Stephen, Mum said, her voice choked. I think we've had enough. Wait, Olivia chirped. He said there's more. What did you find? Before great Uncle Stephen could open his mouth, the image disappeared. My jaw dropped. Was that it? What did great Uncle Stephen see? I promptly remembered there was a second disc. This one was unmarked, but I hoped it contained the rest of the interview. There was no video, only audio. The voice that started up was Olivia's. "Hi, Miss Jerity. I'm sorry about my mum, but she's refused to record the rest of what my uncle was saying. But I asked him to continue and secretly recorded the story as a voice memo on my phone. I remember you said earlier this year that history is written by the people who win wars." She sucked in a breath and commenced crying. "But everyone's history is important, even if they are sad, pathetic people, and even if they never won a single thing in their life. I haven't slept though the night since I finished this project, but you have to hear what my uncle has to say." There were tears in my eyes too. The sincerity of her words were beautiful. I was always flattered that she remembered some trite phrase I threw around because it was what my history teacher said to me. Before I got too sappy over it, the audio began again. "Fine," came Mum's frustrated voice. "If you want to hear the rest of the story, fine, but this is not appropriate for a school project." "Let me finish," Great Uncle Stephen snapped. "If it's too much for you, help yourself to a snack in the kitchen. But Olivia wants to know what happened." I heard her mother mumble something and walk away. Olivia and her uncle were alone. I imagined her looking at him expectantly. "So did you find the radio, or did it get ruined when the school got blown up?" He rasped and I heard the distinctive click of a lighter. "That letter," he began slowly, "has a date on it." "What date?" she inquired hungrily. "It was dated 2 weeks before we started rebuilding the school." "Didn't you say the school has been destroyed like 2 years ago?" "Yes," replied Great Uncle Stephen. "It had been." There was silence as I felt goosebumps on my arms. The images that came to my mind were almost too overwhelming to express, but Great Uncle Stephen put them into words effortlessly. Clearly he has spent his whole life thinking about it. This man, this Stanislav, went to a vandalised, falling apart schoolhouse and cleaned up blood and rubble like it was spilled drinks and dust. He smelled at dead bodies in the hallway and believed they were smelling back at him because he liked his radio. He moved around corpses so he could sweep the ground under them. The roof was half collapsed, so when it rained, he must have gotten soaking wet, but was so oblivious that he didn't even feel a thing. I could hear Olivia crying steadily. I found the larder she was talking about. It was all pickled, preserved food that probably tasted like rubbish. Most of the stuff was mouldy. Did you see the dead body?" "Yes, hanging from the ceiling, but still amazingly lifelike. He wasn't rotting away. This hadn't happened years ago." "Did he look peaceful?" she asked, a chord of desperation in her voice. "Couldn't tell you. The smell was rank and his face was blue and his eyes were bulging, like this." I imagined him demonstrating. "And the radio?" Olivia wept. I heard Great Uncle Stephen take a long drag of his cigarette. "It was there all right, and it was still on." Nobody knows what rock bottom truly is until they've hit it. Being abruptly fired from a job you've worked at for the past 10 years, then catching your girl cheating on you with your replacement really makes a man think. Hell, my student loans aren't even paid off yet. What a life this is. After a rather boozy night that consisted of sending out about 4 dozen resumes and horrendously written cover letters, I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, I decided to at least try and make some money at home while waiting for an interview. At that moment, I thought that the best way to go about it was completing those internet surveys that yielded about $5 Subway gift cards and other rubbish that, after about an hour of answering questions, I didn't have any other marketable skills that could have yielded immediate income. It was either that or wasting the day away playing computer games. At least I wouldn't have to pay for food. I did these surveys for about 5 hours before nearly passing out. It was way more excruciating than I had originally anticipated. At the end of those 5 hours, I had accumulated about $45 in cash and gift cards. $9 an hour, not like I was making much more than that before. I was about to close my laptop up for the day and head to a bar in an attempt to drown out my melancholy when I first saw it. It shouldn't even have been noticeable, but for one reason or another, it was. At the bottom corner of the website that I was on existed a tiny, singular advertisement. Maybe it was the simplicity that got me. Plain black letters in a tacky font that read, "Surveys for cash," overlapped completely white background. At least they were direct with the message. One more couldn't hurt, I thought. Might as well scrape together a little more booze money before heading out. I sat back down, clicked on the picture link and prepared myself to grind through some more painstaking inquiries. The first few questions were simple enough. I guess they weren't really questions but more data collection. My name, age, occupation. I thought it was kind of weird that they also asked my height and weight, but it wasn't unheard of. The first real question was a different story though. I must have stared at it, eyes wide and mouth agape, for God knows how long. What the actual hell? In plain English, this is what popped up on my screen. How strong is your urge to currently look behind you? There were 5 options below, ranging from not at all to overwhelming. There was no feasible reason why I should have been afraid at that moment, but I was. I tightened my breathing, trying to make out any subtle noises behind me. There were none. After maybe about 5 minutes, I worked up the courage to look. There was nothing. I sighed in relief and scoffed at myself at the same time. This must have been some kind of joke. However, I decided to entertain it, answering neutral and clicking onto the next question. This is what I read. Why would you look behind you? I smirked, funny, before simply typing in, I don't know, in a response box and once again clicking next. This was the third question. You're on a plane. Apart from you, there is only one other passenger, who's sitting somewhere behind you. At some point, you get up to go to the washroom and find that the man is gone. You check to see if he is in the only other bathroom on the plane, but he isn't. What do you do? Again, I must have stupidly stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. Was this some kind of obscure personality test? I mean, it must have been, right? I put the same answer that I used for the last question. I don't know. It was true, I didn't know. How was I supposed to answer this kind of question? I clicked next again. Now more intrigued than anything. The fourth question went like this. You wake up in woods unfamiliar to you. It's night time and the moonlight provides you with only slight visibility. About 30 feet away from you, there is a small, dimly illuminated cabin. The door is open and a smiling woman is motioning you to come in. Do you go? Explain why. This question wasn't necessarily weirder than the last one, so my conjecture was that this was some kind of odd personality test, which was still a feasible option. I actually make an attempt to answer this one. Something along the lines of going into the cabin because there's simply nowhere else to go. Once again, I click next. Probably shouldn't have. The questions started getting, messed up. They weren't too gory or explicit, not anything like that. They were just stranger, weirder, more psychologically disturbing. If you're wondering why the hell I kept going, I can't really give you an explicit answer to that. I just felt like I had to. It was an historic, creepy sensation that I can't quite explain away. But I could never shake it, so I just went on. Some of the questions that stood out were, suppose that you wake up one night to find an elevator in your house. During every midnight after that, it opens up for 5 minutes, revealing an exact copy of yourself that gets progressively more injured as time goes on. Do you keep living like this, or do you enter the elevator once and end it all? And then there was another. You're in a hotel room, but are awoken by a rapid knocking at your window. You peek through the blinds, seeing what happens to be a man missing both his eyes. He puts his mouth to the glass and tells you to kill the woman in the bathroom immediately. Do you listen to him? This, though, was one of my least favourites. You're watching home videos with your mother. One of the tapes includes footage of her being murdered by a masked intruder. Your mother simply laughs at this footage about it without saying anything. In your opinion, is this a cause for concern? In addition to this instantly inducing question, there were some rather disconcerting events happening in real life as well. I received a knock at the door about 30 minutes in. I looked through my peephole to find a guy standing there, frantically shaking his head and mouthing no, while making direct eye contact with me. He looked terrified, but obviously I didn't open up. I received about 10 phone calls from somebody named The Auditor on my caller ID. They left a message every time, but each one was just a recording that consisted of somebody saying numbers through heavy static. Well, actually, it sounded more like screaming now that I think about it. But an hour into this thing, and I was on the verge of a mental breakdown. I was petrified of looking behind me, even though there were no indications that anything should have been there. I heard some soft scratching coming from the vent at one point, so I moved my couch over to it. Eventually, I reached what appeared to be the end of the survey. However, it wasn't a question, it was, well, simply a statement. Don't let them in, they're not to be trusted. Almost as if it were on cue, I heard more knocking at my door about 5 seconds after reading this. As slowly and as silently as I could, I moved over and looked through the peephole once again. It was a different person than the one I'd seen earlier. She was a woman, looking to be in her mid-20s. She was wearing a thick blazer despite it being around 90 Fahrenheit outside. She was also wearing sunglasses, so I could never really tell where she was actually looking. She eventually took a piece of paper out of her pocket and slipped it under the door. I looked down and read it. It's lying, leave your apartment immediately. It's been about half an hour since, and I can't bring myself to look at the computer screen nor at the woman outside. She is still there. I can see the shadows of her feet from underneath my door. I heard my bedroom window open a few minutes ago, but I've since jammed the door shut with a chair. I can hear some kind of distorted muttering coming from behind it now. Maybe rock bottom wasn't so bad, but what the hell am I going to do now?
When I first saw him standing out there on the sidewalk, I thought nothing of it. I certainly didn't think he'd still be out there come September. I lingered at the window for just a moment, decided that the night-bound silhouette across the street was just some guy out for a walk, and went to my room and hit the hay. As I stood blearily over the coffee maker the next morning, my eyes strayed up to the window over the sink, and a little shock of adrenaline removed the need for caffeine. He was still there, and still standing on the opposite sidewalk looking at my house. My roommates had all gone to work long ago, so I waited for my coffee, got dressed, and then approached the front door and peered through the peephole. He was still there. I took a deep breath, readied myself for whatever nonsense this was going to entail, and opened the door. His gaze shifted to me as I stepped out onto the porch, and he watched me as I walked across the grass. He tensed when I stepped onto my sidewalk, but then looked relieved when I crossed it and reached the curb. Stopping there, I kept the pavement between us. I didn't know exactly how to ask him what the hell he was doing. Hey, what's up? He looked a bit nervous. Nothing, just hanging out. From where I was standing, he didn't appear to be homeless or crazy. He was just a man of about 40 dressed in a dark blue robe, and I vaguely recognized him. Don't you live in that house? I pointed up to the driveway behind him. He nodded. Yep, that's mine. Just came out to get the newspaper. I glanced down at his hand, where he held an orange bag with the newspaper rolled up inside it. Well, looks like you got it. I paused. Another orange bag was lying further up the driveway, as if the one he was holding was actually yesterday's. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with a masked, nervous expression. Did I see you out here last night too? I asked. Yep, that was me. I looked down further and saw that his feet were bare. You weren't out here all night, were you? I expected him to laugh off the idea, but instead he replied, I was. You've been out here all night in bare feet. Panic was oozing out from under his mask of calm politeness in a dozen different ways. Yes. Now I was starting to feel more than a little weird. Are you going to stand out here all day too? He strained to speak, but then seemed to change his reply. I might, it's beautiful weather out. Well, that much was true. It was a warm summer's day, bright and beautiful. Well, could you at least not stare at my house then? He began to give an apologetic shrug, but stopped halfway through the motion and tried to turn. His bare feet never lifted from the sidewalk. The attempted turn was more of a twist from the thighs up. That, too, stopped rather quickly, and then he said, His gaze moved in a circle before he finally looked directly at me. Your house is nice. I like looking at it. But then I was getting rather annoyed. What's your name? Russ. Russ? Well, it's nice to meet you. I shook my head. I'd never had to do this before. If you don't stop being weird and staring at our house, I'm going to call the police. His eyes lit up. Yes, please do that. That was a weird enough reaction that I actually got out my phone. I'd been raised to never involve the police for any reason, but this was abnormal enough that I felt I had to. I told the dispatcher we had a strange man standing outside our house and that he'd been there literally all night. Yes, all night. She said 2 officers would be with us shortly. Russ and I didn't talk much while waiting for them. He just stood there looking at me at random times, and around the neighborhood otherwise. Ours was a quiet street, populated by nice people who kept mostly to themselves. We never even had cause to really meet each other. If we had, I might have known more about Russ. But as things were, he was just some man acting strangely. Although his aura of masked nervousness calmed as a squad car turned down the lane and approached us. 2 uniformed officers climbed out and approached us with tired stances. One asked dismissively, What seems to be the issue, gentlemen? Russ looked to me hopefully. I told them, this guy has been standing out here staring at our house all night long. The second cop rolled his eyes, but he did ask Russ, Is that true, sir? Russ gulped and stated, Yes. Both cops straightened at the unexpected answer. The first one asked, Seriously? Russ nodded. The second cop looked at each of us for a moment and then said, Well, move it along then. Russ tensed and stood a little taller. No. What? I said no. As the pair began walking towards him, he added, Sir. As one got out handcuffs, the other sneered and said, Listen, asshole. But he stalked about 2 feet from Russ. His partner froze as well. Come on, Russ urged them. What are you waiting for? Come on! The 2 men looked at each other with haunted expressions, then began to back away. The handcuffs were returned to their belt. No, Russ shouted at them. Do it, you pricks, you pigs, ugly bastards. Come on, beat me up. Teach me a lesson. Knock me down. The first cop's face was pale. You're fine, sir. You're absolutely right. We're pigs. Just do what you like. Stand there as long as you want. You're on your property, technically, so this is none of our business. The second glanced at me with an apologetic terror, both jumped in their car and peeled away. Russ screamed incoherently after them, but did not move from his spot on the sidewalk. I called the station a second time to ask what had happened, but after taking my address, the dispatcher told me never to call again and hung up. The anger faded out of Russ, and he saw me lower the phone. And I stood there, awkwardly, as the grown man across the street began to outright cry. I'd never seen a 40-year-old man blubber from sheer hopeless terror. "Russ, what's going on?" He couldn't answer past his tears. Looking left and right first, I finally stepped onto the street and got near him. I had the strangest notion, but I couldn't articulate it. The words simply wouldn't come to mind. An instinctual awareness was the most I could manage. I did reach the opposite curb right in front of him, and I was intent on pushing him back off his spot on the sidewalk, but I changed my mind about 2 feet away from him. It would have been weird to touch a crying, grown man. I stepped back to the street, confused. I tried a second time. At 2 feet away from him, literally within arm's reach, I changed my mind again. He could do what he liked. Who was I to interfere if he wanted to stand outside on a beautiful day? Each time I got close and then changed my mind, his tears and terror deepened. I remember murmuring, "All right, screw this," and backed up to the middle of the street to get space for a running start. I couldn't articulate what I was doing, but I guessed that a leaping tackle might work. I braced myself and then launched forward, ready to spring up at the proper distance. But as I went to jump at him, I changed my mind. There was nothing wrong, and I was being silly. Who cared about any of this? I slowed and curved away. His sobbing became a river. Despite an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong, I turned and went slowly back inside. I could still see him through the kitchen window, and I began going about the business of my day with a muted horror that I could not acknowledge gnawing at my heart. Each time I looked, I would hope against hope that he had moved, but he was always still there, shaking, crying, and looking around for help. That was June. A pall hung over our neighbourhood. Where once my roommates and I had held board game parties and half a dozen people over, now we ate meagre meals in silence. Whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work or perhaps an event we were looking forward to, we would get out half a sentence and then be overwhelmed by a sense of hollowness. Who could care about a concert or a trip to a water park at a time like this? We would stop our sentence midway through the glance out the kitchen window as a group. Always, Russ was standing there. He successfully avoided dangerous sunburns by lifting his robe over his head during the brightest hours, and he had a nearby tree to shade him at other times. His bare feet took the worst of it, and were red and boiled over a week. During that second week, we gathered daily as a neighbourhood. It was impossible not to have noticed him standing out there by then, and all the various residents of our street wandered out to speak to him and to one another with various polite topics which strained undertones. "Terrible weather," a neighbour would say, her eyes fearful. "The weather was gorgeous and beautiful." "Absolutely terrible weather," another one of us would say. "Horrifying, in fact. What the hell is happening with the weather?" I remember the oldest of us, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and was normally tough as nails, then cried openly and sobbed, "Why is the weather doing this?" Russ stood through all of this, visibly, hopefully, and terrified. The old woman screamed at him, "Why don't you just go inside?" He could only shrug and shakily tell her, "I don't want to go inside. I like sunburns on my feet." She approached with both hands up to throttle him, but changed her mind as she came within reach. "You're a man. You can take it. I shouldn't interrupt your enjoyment of nature." She hobbled away in tears, trembling violently. Another of our neighbours stepped forward. "At least take these clothes." He held a folded shirt and a pair of jeans forward. but turned away before getting close enough to hand them over. You probably don't want my old hand-me-downs. Right, Russ replied hopelessly. I'm fine, thanks though. It was the rainy season in our parts, and it began to drizzle on our heads, so we retired to our homes to gaze out the window and watch Russ thirstily hold open his mouth to the sky. Once the torrent was heavy enough, he could also lean down and scoop water from the flow running along the curb that gave us an idea. As a neighbourhood, we began to wash our cars more often. The runoff from the hoses would flow past Russ, allowing him to drink and stay alive, but only for as long as was normal for washing one's car. None of us mentioned it to one another, we just saw others doing it, so we did it too. The rainy season also brought worms up off the ground, which he ate, and he learned to stand still long enough for birds to come near. He would grab them and eat them whole. The sidewalk near him became foul with waste until each new rain washed it clean. One of the men on the street began building a long wood and metal contraption. For the first time in a month, we had something else to see outside our windows, and we watched him for nearly a week before getting a sense of what he was doing. It was a massively long Rube Goldberg machine full of levers, swinging hammers, rolling balls, and other assorted nonsense. From the 2x4s he'd laid out, he'd planned for it to extend all the way down the street, around the corner and out of sight. My roommates and I took a few days off work and wordlessly began helping. The older women in the neighbourhood brought out drinks and food for us. Russ looked on while we ate and drank, but he watched especially carefully while we worked. I'd never been one for tools, but I muddled through figuring out how to saw and nail things effectively, and the other men in the neighbourhood joined us without a word when they saw how serious we were. It took 6 days, but finally finished the contraption on the eve of a big storm. As the sky was growing dark, we gathered around the corner out of sight of Russ and stared at the button that would activate the machine. If all the levers and hammers and contraptions worked, Russ would be knocked over by a battering ram mechanism at the very end. We stared at the button. Our jogger approached and we stared at her. She slowed and looked worried that 30-odd people were watching her. We back up and glanced at the button repeatedly. You want me to push this? She asked, cautious but concerned. Is this for some sort of prank video? We looked at each other and the old woman who had survived the Great Depression shrugged and nodded. The jogger moved close and hovered her hand over the button, before backing up. Nah, I'd rather not participate in a prank video. Her expression was fearful and pained. She jogged on as we stood in despair. The storm came and destroyed most of the mechanisms. The man who'd started it took it down in grief-stricken silence over the course of the next week. Russ watched the process with despondent eyes. A moving truck pulled up one morning and we gathered on the street to watch his wife begin packing things. Russ lost his job because he stopped showing up, she explained, and now we can't afford the place anymore. She looked over at him with narrowed eyes and said hatefully, I don't understand why he's doing this, but I'm not staying with an unemployed loser who would rather stand around all day than do some honest work. This is honest work, he called over, crying despite his words. It's tough standing here without rest. I do get tired, but someone has to do it. We watched her put Russ's son in the passenger seat and then drive off with most of his contents in his house. We looked to Ross. He gulped, wiped his tears away, and gave the flimsiest reasoning I'd yet heard. It's more important that I stand here than go after my family. I didn't value them anyway. He seemed to give up after that, letting the sun sear his flesh day after day and not even bothering to eat the worms that followed each storm. That was July. The first party our street had seen in months nearly sparked a riot. Our place was one of two on the street designed as off-campus housing, and the other house kicked off a kegger at about 7 o'clock one night. Outrage and anger flowed with us into the foyer of that house. The college guys therein turned down the music and had their friends hang back a second as the entire neighbourhood crowded in. The old woman asked, "What the hell do you think you are doing?" "Having a party," one of the guys responded. "What's the problem? We're not being loud." I was actually the one who spoke next. I remember my neighbour's anger vividly. "How can you have a party while things are the way they are?" One of the other guys who lived there protested. "So what? We are supposed to just stop everything and not live our lives because of the way things are?" The guest looked at us in confusion. The most painful part about the argument was that the guys were right. We couldn't just stop our lives because of what was happening on our street. The shouts and yells from each side were more about how we felt than any logical debate, and a fistfight broke out just long enough to knock over the keg and break 2 glasses. We held each other back and retreated as a neighbourhood, leaving the college guys to the party. I was bitter, so bitter, and we all felt the bitterness together, until another neighbour had a party 2 nights later. A week after that, one of my roommates had her friends over for a board game night, and I have to admit that it felt like such a relief to return to normality. At the end of the night, I walked the last of our friends out. I had one last joke and a laugh and then waved after them. Russ was just a silhouette in the darkness, always there but no longer on our minds all the time. Of course, the next morning the guilt hit me like a load of bricks as I stood over my coffee maker and studied the boil-covered red scarecrow across the street. His blue robes were growing tattered after months outside, and he looked like a burned corpse. Unfortunately, I had a stressful day ahead and I couldn't afford to process my guilt at the moment. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was the one who did it. I closed the blinds over the kitchen window. I was supposed to have been just for the day, just so I could get through the big project at hand. But the blinds never came back up after that. As a house, as a group, we stopped looking out the window, just like washing our cars, just like working on the Rube Goldberg machine. And just like her reaction to the party, my neighbourhood took that as a cue. Within 5 days, all the blinds and all the windows in the entire street were lowered, the first night that Russ was completely alone outside in the dark. With all the blinds closed, an absolute guarantee that nobody was looking out for him or at him. I laid in my bed staring at the ceiling and crying quietly. This was not like the other pains on this street, not like the ones that couldn't be articulated. I knew exactly what I had done this time, and I could think and say the words since it was my issue and my guilt alone. I was the first one to close the blinds. I wanted to be the first to raise them again, to look out upon our neighbourhood problem and force everyone else to open their eyes and unite again. But I didn't have the courage. I needed to work. I needed to pay rent. I couldn't be the one, because raising my blinds would mean acknowledging the problem, and I couldn't afford to be racked by guilt and confusion and pain any longer. Each night I prayed that someone else would be the first to raise their blinds. Surely someone would do it. It was the only consensuous path, and someone would definitely feel compelled to do the right thing. Then we could all do it together. I'd put the issue out of my thoughts for so long that I was actually startled when I saw Russ healthier than before, with nobody mowing his lawn or trimming his trees, and with an abnormally rainy season. The greenery around him had grown to shade him near the entire day. His skin was back to a decent colour, where crinkled parchment had peeled off, and a large number of crickets and other bugs had taken up residence in his waist-high lawn. On these he fed, reaching down to grab insects at random and eat them when the urge struck him. I had looked because a car had pulled up, and I watched as a real estate lady got out and began pestering him. "Hey," I shouted from across the way, defensive over our issue. You leave Russ alone. This is ridiculous, she called back. I need to sell this property and I'm never going to do that. And I'm never going to get a buyer interested in a property with a weathered homeless man standing outside of it. He's not homeless, I shouted at her. That's his home. Not anymore. His wife got it in a divorce because he failed to show up to the hearings. I don't know why I said it. I meant the sidewalk. Somehow at some unknown point, I had accepted it as simply the way things were. The real estate lady glared at me and then at Russ, and then she got in her car and left. I knew what would happen next, and my roommates and I harassed the landscaping crew she sent until he got fed up and left too. If they moved the lawn and pruned the trees, Russ would be in serious trouble. We congratulated ourselves for a job well done and went back into our houses for board game night. That was August. The derisive talk began earlier this month. As the first chill of autumn hit the air, I think people instinctively knew that the worst was yet to come for him. Whenever we happened to glance his way, someone would spit and call him an idiot for standing there like that. Why doesn't he just go inside? Someone would ask. Yeah, what a dumbass, someone else would say. I just stared at them when they said these things. I did wish it would stop, that he would stop, but I don't know. I just don't know. I was prompted to write this and share our situation because I saw it in myself. I saw my feelings turning toward blame and hatred. I asked the same questions. Why was he doing this? Why wouldn't he just go inside? But the strange, dread notion that I could not articulate drove me to go outside and do something no one else had done in weeks. Talk to him. Hey Russ, I said by way of opening, since I had no idea what else to say. His hair was mane and his beard was wild, but there was still a man under there. He coughed to clear his throat and then managed to say, Hey. There was really no beating around the bush. You gave up for a little while there, didn't you? He nodded weakly. What changed your mind? Why are you eating and drinking again? Why do you fight so hard to survive? I asked him, my heart full of compassion. I felt like I was such a great person for caring when nobody else did. I will never forget his bemused, angry laugh. He tilted his head and said, To stick it to you assholes. That was the one answer I'd never expected. We had done so much for him, gone through so much guilt and angst and effort, but I guess I'd never thought about what it was like on the other side of the blinds. Standing there night after night, knowing the entire neighborhood was avoiding looking at you. I don't have an answer. I don't have any answers. I wanted to tell him good luck, but I would have just sounded hollow. I nodded and went inside. This time, I raised the blinds and stood by the kitchen window. As the first flakes of snow for the season began to fall, I accepted his angry gaze. Would the heat of his hate be enough to keep him warm through this winter? Summer seems impossibly far away, especially without so much as a blanket. And yet all the people who come over, all my friends and roommates and acquaintances, all just keep asking idly, why doesn't he just go inside? If only it were that simple.
Number 1. One former Navy serviceman recounted his chilling experience while he was living aboard a barge in Norfolk in 1999. He and another crew member shared a fondness for World War II history, so his friend gave him a strange book. It was about the Nazis trying to find and use occult artifacts to help them win the war. He writes, For those not overly religious, the spear of destiny was the spear used by the Roman soldier Longinus to pierce the side of Christ during the crucifixion. The myth went that anyone that possessed Longinus' spear would hold godlike powers. The Nazis were crazy enough to believe in that stuff. One night he was reading the book before going to bed. It was a chapter about Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler, who led an archaeology team for the SS during the war. After that, he put the book under his pillow and fell asleep. Later that night, he awoke to the sound of slow, heavy footsteps walking through the bunks in the dark. Once the footsteps passed him, he recounted, all of a sudden, the curtains to my rack began to blow in towards me, and I can't even describe the cold that accompanied it. It was as if freezing wind was howling in upon me, and I could feel my jaw lock tight, my teeth instantly becoming a solid block of ice that froze and fused together. I grew up in Michigan and had never known such a cold in all my life. I tried to cry out as the cold pierced me deeply to the core, like 10 million frozen needles stabbing me all at once. It was truly indescribable. He heard the footsteps pass by him again, and the door to the sleeping compartment open and close. Everything returned to normal. He gave the book back to his friend the next day and told him what happened. The friend laughed it off, but a few weeks later, he experienced the exact same thing. So what does this service member think was responsible for his eerie encounter? He writes, had it been the conniving former chicken farmer Heinrich Himmler, head of the dreaded SS, or could it have been someone even more foul and loathsome? The evil spirit of Adolf Hitler himself, exacting a little payback scare on two active duty US servicemen, the grandson of the men that had helped defeat his military machine. We can only guess. Number 2. This story comes from Reddit user Igloo444. Their grandfather was a member of the British Army and was stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps during the winter of 1943. The village quickly got snowed in and all the telephone lines were out. The roads were blocked and the whole battalion was just stuck in the Swiss Alps for the entire winter. Most of the villagers only spoke German and most of the troops only spoke English. So when the troops were out at the local bar one night and a man began yelling, "Where? Take you the children," at them, they were pretty confused. They rounded up a translator and took the man back to the base, where he told them that since their arrival, several small objects had gone missing: a tarp, some wood, an axe-like weapon called a halberd, and then the children started disappearing. If it had just been one child, they probably would have written it off as a weird or tragic accident. They were, after all, stuck in the mountains, surrounded by snow and wild animals. But 3 kids? Yeah, that's weird. So Igloo444 writes, the captain told the villagers that he would continue to look into the matter, and that he would begin sending some of his men to patrol the streets each night looking for whoever or whatever was the culprit behind all the strange thefts and abductions. Later that night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man? It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down a healthy full-grown man on its own. Naturally, rumours began to surface that there was some sort of monster living in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the occupants of the village. So they keep doing nightly patrols. One night, the grandfather and a few other soldiers see a person standing outside the windows of a darkened house, peering into it. They shout for the figure to stay put. Instead, it takes off running. They gave chase, and eventually it jumped into a hidden cave and began shooting at them. They returned fire, and when the shooting stopped, they investigated. They found Reginald in the cave, dead, surrounded by 7 half-eaten children. Number 3. In Colmar, France, a young woman experienced something strange in the summer of 1991. Her family had just moved into a new house and she found a hole in the wall of the attic. Through the hole, she could see another room. but as far as she could tell, it had no door. She felt something strange coming from the hole but didn't investigate. Later, she went back with a flashlight and saw something. There was a young man sitting on the floor, his knees against his chest. His arms were crossed on his knees, like he was hugging himself. He turned his head towards them and smiled. We bolted out of the room and went to the storage room. My heart was pounding. I was out of breath. I first thought that it was a real person, but he had no colour. It was like a 3D dark shadow, and we never heard any footsteps. My friend refused to admit that we had saw a ghost, and we never talked about it. My grandmother learnt later that our house was a clandestine printing office during World War II. The owners printed slogans against the Germans, but I think that there was something else in that house. I believe that the secret room was used to hide people. Number 4. One father took a trip through France with his family. He wanted to visit Normandy and see a few sights from World War II. His daughter was 7 years old at the time, and he says that she had, at that point, never been exposed to any history about World War II and didn't know what either side's uniforms looked like. After they returned home, things got a little odd. He writes, "Over the past year, my daughter has often spoke of things or men that she saw looking at her, pointing guns at her, and following her while we were in the bunkers and around Normandy area. She often described them as crouching down, hiding behind corners, holding guns and looking as if they were very mad." He started asking her questions about what she saw. Here's one conversation he had. "Were you scared?" "Yes, but I knew they weren't trying to hurt me, so I didn't think anything of it, but there were a lot of them. Everywhere I looked, they were moving around like army men do, kind of crawling but bent over. When we would walk out of a bunker, I would see one in the grass or behind a tree. Then when I was in the car, I could see them looking at me from behind a fence in a field. Sometimes a lot of them, sometimes only one or two." She also described their uniforms perfectly, camouflage and everything. Number 5. The SS Alkimos was built as an American ship for use in the World War II. It was sold to Norway, which used it for weapon transport during the war. In 1944, a radio operator who worked on the ship was killed by one of the crew, who then shot himself. Norway covered up the incident and claimed that she was killed by enemy fire. After the war, the ship was sold to a Greek shipping company. Strange, unexplained accidents kept happening with the ship. In 1963, it crashed into a reef off the coast of Australia. It was towed to Fremantle for repairs, but while it was there, the Alkimos caught fire and had to be towed to Hong Kong for more work. It had barely left Fremantle when the tow line snapped and it ran aground. The tow company couldn't get it unsunk, so they left a caretaker on board until something could be done. The caretaker experienced many strange things on board, including feelings of anger, knocking, footsteps and voices. Over the years, a few companies tried to salvage the ship, but each time someone tried, bad things would happen to their crew. Eventually, it was abandoned and began slowly sinking into the water, where it can still be seen today.
Number 1. There's an abandoned and boarded up World War II fort in the southern part of Belgium that we often sneak into with the scouts. Getting in there requires scaling a sheer wall where we've placed anchoring points for ropes and climbing gear next to a relatively busy road. So you're being super quiet, making no light and cowering every time a car passes by so he doesn't spot you in his lights. The atmosphere is set. The moment you enter it, it's like diving into water. Sound stops and the entire place is at a constant 14 degrees Celsius, with a slight breeze passing through. The tunnel is barely large enough for me, slightly broader than average person, to pass without turning my body sideways. The tunnel is just high enough to work up a decent gait while hunched over. If someone ahead of you blocks a passage for a moment, the breeze stops and it feels like the entire tunnel network takes a breath. Because of the way the tunnels are constructed, they echo in such a way that your own footsteps seem to be coming from behind you. They also seem to take one more step than you do when you stop. Of course, we don't allow the guys and gals to take any source of light in there, so it's pretty scary overall. So, I'm in there, posted at a side passage to ensure everyone takes the same path and doesn't get lost. I go in first, before any of the claimers arrive, so they don't know there are friendly faces in there to help them. I'm in there for a while, just waiting for the first to come by, when I see a dancing little light coming down the long hallway. I quietly settle back in my nook and wait for whoever was smart enough to hide some matches and take them away. The light quietly bops closer when I realize there aren't any footsteps accompanying it. I poke my head around the corner just in time to see it disappear. I hear no footsteps still. I settle back and wait some more, when I realize I do hear some scuffling, very faint, breathing noises, but still very faint. I become aware of a wet heat coming from right in front of me, with a faint smell of person, sweat or dirt. Suddenly I realize there's someone there, right in front of me, inches from my face. The breathing stops suddenly. Whatever it is aware of me as well. Whatever or whoever it is, we're both holding our breath, both acutely aware of each other. It takes ages. I'm sitting there, unable to move, speak or breathe properly. The wet heat passes, and some minutes later I become aware of a very faint light coming from my right side, which soon dissipates and leaves. Sometime later still, I hear the familiar stomping of combat boots coming down the hallway from my left. I stop the person, tell them to keep following the passageway and take the first right they come to. Out of curiosity, I ask who went in first. No one. He went in first. Number 2. I once was alone at Moorgate Station in London after staying for a few after-work drinks with my buddy who also works in Central. It was around 10 PM, so I left the pub and walked to the station and found I had missed the previous train by about 5 minutes. Moorgate Station is an underground station, but the overground trains depart and terminate there. The train that I need to catch always departs from one of 2 platforms that are in their individual tunnels adjacent to one another but accessible by foot as they are connected by paths that connect the platforms every 15 feet or so. I was sat on the bench right at the end, near where the front of the train would be departing. As I sat there I saw some movement in the corner of my eye, so I turned and stared to see just a regular guy dressed in dark clothing come through from the other platform passage about 10 meters from me, and thought nothing of it. He went by the track, stared down, backed away, and ran back through the passage to the other platform. I thought to myself that was weird and quickly got up to follow him and find out why he was running if he was okay. I was no more than 5 seconds behind him, and the exit entry to the platform is right by the other end, which was a good 150 meters or so away. As I go through the passage to the other platform, I look to see no one there. I then went back to the other platform and again, I was the only one there apart from a woman who just reached the bottom of the escalator to the platform entrance right down the other end. It was something I couldn't explain. and I was sure I couldn't recall any footsteps that made it even weirder. London is an old place and has a lot of history, so not sure if there was an event that could have reasoning to what I experienced, but it's a memory that will always stick with me. Number 3. Although it's technically not an urban exploring, as a former electrician, I think I can still share one moment from a job I had to do about 13 years ago. Me and my job partner were called out to a larger restoration job that was being done to an older house from the early 1900s. The house was still until this point a family-owned house which had 2 owners since it was built, and the last owner was an old lady who had passed away there whilst being the last person in her family line. It was a sad story on its own, and nobody could take over the house. So the house got auctioned to a younger couple that bought it for an insane amount of money due to how large the house was. But it was now time to get the old house up to modern standards, which included a completely new installation from scratch, as the old cables around the house were the type of cables that was insulated with black cotton and fastened with handcrafted wooden clamps. While working in the first floor was quite easy as the entire installation process was made to fit inside the new wall frames that the carpenters were setting up, we eventually had to move on to the second floor and prepare for setting up a new intake from the attic, which would then pass down to the new main fuse box on the second floor. We opened the hatch to the attic, and while using the flashlight to look up there, we could surely see that the attic was very cramped, so the smallest of us all would have to go up there to fix everything to get the intake cable settled while removing the old one. As you might guess, I was the smallest of us, and had to do that rubbish job of going up where nobody probably had been for many, many years. So I decided to grab a lunch break and mentally prepare myself for what I expected to become a pretty rubbish job. After eating, I grabbed my flashlight and tool belt and started climbing up the stairs. And while climbing upwards, I noticed that the smell that we thought was pretty much old people smell as they die was getting increasingly stronger. But I had to continue, so I got to the top and crawled myself onto something stable when I got up, while noticing that the smell up there was pretty damn bad. So I grabbed my flashlight to look around and get somewhat orientated about where to crawl. Looking forward, it seemed like a pretty straightforward route towards the intake point that I could see in the distance. But out of curiosity, I wondered if there was anything else up here. So I looked to my right, only to light up 5 carcasses of what once was the old lady's cats that probably died. One of them were more or less intact, whilst being visibly partially eaten by various insects or whatever eats stuff, while 2 of them were more or less just rotten dried skin and bones. At that moment, I absolutely regretted my decision to eat lunch, and the sight of along with the realization about what I had smelled all along was these dead cats, and I immediately threw up on the spot before very swiftly noping the hell out of there. After some talk back and forth, we came to the possibility that the old lady had been throwing her cats up there when they died, one by one, but we will never know for sure since the lady had died. The new owners had no idea about this when buying the house, but our company ended up denying to continue the work until the attic had been cleaned appropriately. This apparently took them about 1 month to complete. I guess there are not many companies who want to deal with that kind of nasty stuff, but my partner at work ended up finishing the work in the attic afterwards as he felt kinda bad for me. And then I decided not to continue being an electrician anymore, as this was not work I really enjoyed doing, especially not after the event. Number 4. After the Community Care Act in Scotland in the early 90s, a lot of big sprawling long-stay mental hospitals were closed down and all the patients moved into smaller houses and homes, spread out through the community. A lot of these old sites are still standing though. In Dundee we have a Strathmartin Hospital, the core of which was constructed in the 1800s and expanded. Back in the day, it was kind of the place you'd be sent if you were an unwed mother or a bad child. The place was bought over to develop into flats, but the owner went bankrupt in the recession. So the whole site is standing there unprotected by security. Albeit surrounded by fences and kinda difficult to get to, me and a few friends had broken in a few times and it's hella creepy. Wards with beds and furniture perfectly presented. Wards with beds and furniture perfectly preserved. Old mass communal bathrooms, open loft shafts. Meds rooms with health posters and medication still there. Children's ward with child's pictures still on the wall decades later. Mental health wards with seclusion areas. Old crematorium, a gym and a swimming pool. People don't realise these hospitals were entirely self-contained communities. If there's interest, I can upload some pictures. A couple of stories though. On the children's ward, my friend who was filming, who's a bit of a spiritualist, said she felt a presence and got really anxious. I laughed it off, but when you play the video back, when she expresses that she feels something, the clip is all freakily distorted. Another story is when we were in the L-shaped building. I swear on my life, I heard whistling and footsteps coming round the corner. We quickly scrambled and hid, thinking security had found us. But no one was there. Number 5. I grew up in Frederick, Maryland back in the mid-90s to early 2000s when I was a teenager. The city still had a very Rust Belt vibe before its fairly recent revival into a hipster-infested douche mecca. It had a fairly large blue-collar presence, particularly along the city's open-air drainage canal, which back when I was growing up was flanked on both sides by tons of abandoned or condemned buildings, both residential and industrial. Now it's all sushi fusion joints, hilariously overpriced condos and vintage thrift shops like every other city in the East Coast. Anyway, back then we would roam around the city and break into abandoned buildings for fun. Sometimes we'd vandalise the place, but usually we would just explore and use them as hangout spots when we could drink and smoke weed without having to worry about cops. There were a bunch of creepy moments, particularly when you'd break into a condemned house only to discover that one or more homeless people had set up in there. My city kind of had a bad reputation for having a lot of severely mentally ill homeless people back then, paranoid schizophrenics and such, a bunch of whom I knew by name back then. One memory that stands out though was an abandoned house we broke into which had clearly been vacant for many years, with visible black mold growing on the walls. It was weird because it had clearly been occupied by a family previously because of all their stuff was still there, like the rapture happened and they just disappeared. Beds, dressers with clothes, family photos on the walls, all of that. We didn't dare open the fridge. It really seemed like for some reason the family drove away one day and just never returned. It was super creepy walking through their home with flashlights and just getting this rotted glimpse into their lives before whatever happened.